Hi again. Nice to meet you. Thanks for being here with us. So imagine that I don't know anything about Hyperledger. How would you explain to me what your company does?
Okay, so Hyperledger is a project hosted at the Linux Foundation. And the Linux Foundation is a nonprofit. It's a consortium of over 1,000 different companies who work together and pool some money, pool their technical talent, pool time, et cetera, to go and build technology projects, right? So obviously the most famous one we're known for is Linux. And then cloud computing, software-defined networking, all this software that's infrastructural. And so the Linux Foundation launched Hyperledger about 2.5 years ago to go and try to do something similar in the blockchain technology space. To say, hey, there's all these projects. Some of them are cryptocurrency focused. Some of them can use blockchains for other types of applications, right? Where it's not necessarily so much about a token. And there'll probably be a lot of these different ledgers out there, but shouldn't they all share the same code? Right? If they differ by 5 or 10% a little bit, then shouldn't 90% of that be common? And so at Hyperledger and at the Linux Foundation, what we're trying to do is pull together all these different projects and give them a home to live where they are kind of neutral. They're not attached to any one company, any one vendor, but then become like a public good, something that people can build on top of. And we act somewhat like air traffic control. We're not writing the software ourselves, right? We are kind of working with big companies like IBM, small startup companies, companies in China, companies in Europe, all over. They write the code. We just act kind of as like the people who integrate that together and then give that the kind of things that help enterprises trust using this software.
I'm glad you mentioned enterprises because quite recently, I'm sure you've heard of it, Bitcoin developer Jimmy Son mentioned in an interview that blockchain for enterprise does not make sense. So to be exact, he said like using blockchain for tech for a private centralized system such as enterprise makes 0 sense. And he named Hyperledger as an example.
Yeah, I didn't see the interview, and I don't really know Jimmy that well.
It's a podcast. Yeah, it is online.
It's no time
it's
for
a podcast.
So.
Yeah,
but it sounds like something that somebody would say who's not really spent any time in this space, right?
Yes.
Because to us, like centralization is not a you have it or you don't. There's a spectrum, right? There are solutions that are more centralized and less centralized. If you look at something like Facebook, Facebook is highly centralized. They have all the data, they have all the control over what gets displayed. They let people come in and build apps maybe here and there, but like they set the ground rules, right? If you look at something like the internet is much more decentralized, but there's still people involved at organizations that help bring it all together, like ICANN, which helps the domain name system work, or IANA, which does the IP numbers, right? They're the ones who kind of set the rules for which IP address allocations people get. And I think to a purist, even ICANN and IANA would look like centralized organizations. But really, they're very decentralized, right? It's not hard today to register a domain name or to get an IP address, right? Those systems work. If you think of this as a spectrum, many of these technologies like Hyperledger that help move marketplaces and companies away from a need for a centralized entity at the center of a marketplace to something that is more decentralized, more cooperative, more with parties working together, but still having a governing entity, still having somebody who helps say, here's the common technology that we'll choose for this ledger, and here's the ground rules. And by the way, if some of that we'll be able to implement through software, but some of that is legal. Some of that are things like, if there's data sharing going on about people's private information, well, there's a legal contract that we have about what you can do with that data or not do, right? And so every network out there, every business network has this mix of governance that can be automated and governance that requires kind of a legal infrastructure. And so the permissioned ledger approach, the consortium ledger approach, makes much more sense. And I think, again, I didn't listen to Jimmy's full description, so I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, but it just doesn't sound like he's been in that world.
He has been for a very long time. He's a
I know
Bitcoin core developer.
I know he's in the public cryptocurrency world, and he's in the Bitcoin world, but there's a lot, I call it like Vegas versus Chicago, right?
Okay.
In Vegas, you're very interested in like Lamborghinis and like pumping up the value of things and like making lots of money because it feels like a game of chance, right? But in Chicago, people are worried about supply chains. They're worried about insurance. They're worried about these kind of prosaic applications, business marketplaces and applications where they're not sexy. They're not necessarily about making $1 billion, although they are about moving billions and trillions of dollars around. And that's really where you could think Hyperledger. We solve problems more for that space than we solve them for people who want to play the odds.
For you, decentralization is technology that you provide to this company, or the way you work. So
we don't have a single ledger ourselves. We don't have a coin. We don't have our members are working with our facilitation to create software, right? And that's software that you can download and use. You don't have to ask us permission. You don't have to pay a license fee. There's no branding or whatever. You can pull this down, and you and a network of other companies that you want to work with to establish a common system of record all run this software to spin up your own blockchain. And then you can use other technologies that we have at Hyperledger, like Hyperledger Quilt, to connect that to other ledgers. So if you want to, buy a piece of property, the title of which is tracked on one ledger, and pay for it using tokens or collateral that exists on another network, you use this thing called Quilt to do a correlated transaction across those. And this is just much more organic. I would argue it's more decentralized than Bitcoin or Ethereum, right? Because it doesn't have this thing that says we all have to be on the same protocol. We can be on different protocols. We can have different governance models. We can have different legal relationships that we want. And because some markets or some networks are going to want to do like one upgrade a year, they're going to want to lock down the technology and have just a few ways of doing things for security reasons, for regulatory reasons, et cetera. Others will want to update daily. They'll want to have a much more programmable kind of environment. And the two of these should be able to coexist. The two of these should be able to talk to each other, right? And the best way to do that is to provide common software, but leave it to each of the communities to decide what's the pace of change that they want, how frequently do they want to update, how frequently do they want to, and what kind of technical governance layer do they want, and what kind of legal governance layer do they want.
Okay, well, probably the crypto world has a little bit different point of view on the decentralization that you have, but you come from tech world, right?
I'm very much a technologist, yeah.
So my next question is, what kind of a director are you? You work in a blockchain, with the blockchain project, right? So does this idea and philosophy of decentralization somehow influence you in your management?
So I call myself a geek diplomat, okay? And we lead a consortium. So we have 250 organizations who are part of this consortium. And 50 of those are nonprofits, government agencies, academics. They don't pay a dime, but the other 200 pay membership fees to be a part of my consortium, right? And all of that provides us with financial resources to be able to do this air traffic control function. So my staff, I've got about 10 direct reports and 15 kind of part-time that I pull from other parts of the Linux Foundation. We're all Linux Foundation employees. And about half my staff help facilitate the technical communities. But we don't tell them what to build. And we don't tell them like, this is the right way or the wrong way. The way that new technologies come into Hyperledger is somebody says, this is something I want to share with a lot of people. This is something I want a lot of help building. So they propose it. There's a public process where it's vetted. And then there's a technical steering committee that's elected by all the contributors to the different projects who say, yep, that makes sense. Let's bring it in as a project. The other half of my staff is all about how do we go and tell the world about what this community is building? Because we all know that you can build a good technology, but it won't succeed in the market unless you're able to describe it to people, unless you're able to attend events like this. And we have no ICO to fund our marketing engine, so that's basically the function of my staff.
So a geek diplomat is what you do. Like, so you don't interfere a lot, but you give advice?
My job is to help the developers who show up. Right. My job is to help them work better together, more effectively together, more efficiently together, figure out where there might be tools that are keeping them from working together or cultural differences, right? That's one layer of my diplomacy is what is the right structure for us to have for how to organize these efforts so that they produce in high quality, enterprise trustworthy software. The second layer is between companies, because very naturally you'll have a company that says, well, we want to be the first among equals, right? We want to be the one that's really known for this product or that product. And helping them understand that they can still reap benefit by being a part of a cooperative, right? By being able to work with other companies and say, hey, here's 20 companies that deploy Hyperledger Fabric as a service on a cloud, and you can get them from different places, and they have differences, slight differences, and that are just like the differences between AWS and Azure and Google Cloud, right? But that fundamentally these apps should be compatible and interoperable and run, across all these. That kind of diplomacy is essential, right? That kind of connection and getting people to see that the entire ocean rises if they work together, rather than fight each other.
Quite recently you said, and I think we covered this also, you said that you expect blockchain technology to curb the power of Silicon Valley's major technology companies. So can I ask you, how would you imagine a Silicon Valley decentralized or blockchain? Would that be Google decentralized? Would that mean no Facebook? So can you imagine?
So I think both blockchain technology and some of the rebellion that we're seeing from consumers in the form of things like the GDPR, right, which are telling people, no, this compact that we've had between, say, Facebook and its users, that Facebook can do whatever it wants with your data, and it can throw a lot of legalese at you and say, do you accept, right? That needs to change, right? That kind of baseline relationship needs to change.
And you think it may be done with the help of decentralization?
So one technique in this is going to be a move to a new way of handling digital identity called self-sovereign identity. And explaining self-sovereign identity is sometimes as complicated as explaining blockchain technology, right? These are like two pieces, but self-sovereign ID depends upon blockchain technology in a couple of key ways. And so we have a project at Hyperledger called Hyperledger Indy, which is software to stand up a distributed digital identity network. It's being used today by the Sovereign Foundation, which Phil Windley is here as well. He can tell you more about as well. But they're kind of, think of it like an overlay that allows you to connect your identity on one network and one blockchain to your identity on another without making it easy for other people to correlate that as well. Because if they do that, then they can see all the stuff you're doing on both ledgers, right? It's a pretty sophisticated concept, but it's something that we're seeing growing endorsement around big companies like IBM and credit unions and government agencies, down to a whole lot of startups now that are starting to say, we can help build pieces of this infrastructure, and it's decentralized. So that's something that gets me really excited in this space. But I think otherwise, like blockchain technology has a chance for us to bring back auditability and to markets, right? There's a lot of markets where corruption runs rampant, where people, markets agree on a set of rules on how to operate to kind of help everybody play fair. And then oftentimes people like slice through that, don't follow the rules, and end up capturing a lot of value, right? Blockchain technology can, for a lot of use cases, make it impossible to, things like prevention of double spend, right? Or other processes you can implement on top of that, make it much harder to cheat, right? And so if we start using this for all these digital markets that are out there, I think we end up with self-auditing and self-correcting markets that work better, that rely less on regulators, rely less on courts and judges, right? At the end of the day, we still need them out there, because at the end of the day, software still has bugs, right? And people exploit those bugs, right? And I think the fair operation of market is a balance between algorithmic kind of control and human control.
Well, we talked a lot about the blockchain technology. Where do you stand on cryptocurrency as such a big part of the industry?
Right. Let's see. I was gifted some Bitcoin a few years ago that then I sold recently, but it was just a tiny amount. Kind of glad I did. I invested in another one that's been kind of down recently. So
I have to ask, what cryptocurrency did you invest in?
So I bought some Ethereum at what I thought would be the dip, but at like 600, so it's still below that, right? But at the end of the day, I wanted to just make sure that I wasn't operating out of complete ignorance of how those networks work, right? Because I think there's a phrase from George Lakoff, which is, you can't be neutral on a moving train. So it was like, let's see what this is like. And I have to give full credit to people who are working on these technologies in figuring out how to do a number of hard things simultaneously, right? Like a global common ledger to record things is remarkable. A way to upend the payment markets is remarkable. And I kind of see it like You remember the free software movement versus the open source movement? Like,
yes.
It was very useful for people who believed in open source like me to have people like Richard Stallman out there, like pioneering the space, showing that things were possible, even if ultimately like that work was very hard for enterprises to kind of understand how to wrestle with. And open source kind of came along to help professionalize it a bit and help make enterprises a little bit more comfortable using the idea of software that they got for free and where there's some expectation to share back. So. There's a lot of interesting technologies coming out of that space. For example, in Hyperledger, we have a project called Burrow, which is an implementation of the Ethereum VM that now lets you take scripts written for the Ethereum mainnet and run them on consortium ledgers, right? Because if that turns out, if Solidity turns out and the EVM turn out to be like good smart contract languages, then why not try to use them on the enterprise, right? And it's all part of this thing. Like, people present these as like two different worlds, but there's really a spectrum between them. So I'm eager to see, are there other technologies that we can learn from? Maybe there's things we can contribute back. It's interesting, the things like Lightning and other layer 2 scalability approaches are actually consortium technologies, right? They're about, you know, trustworthy, verified nodes, like with offloading a lot of traffic from the public ledgers. So I'd really love to see our communities learn more from each other, and we'd like to be actually a vehicle for more technology sharing between the public cryptocurrency world and the permission ledger world, and consortium ledger world.
You were called one of the people who's leading the blockchain revolution by New York Times. Have you heard? Are you aware of that?
I know, yeah, I saw that.
So do you feel responsibility for being called like that? Do you feel like kind of a responsibility to the community that you're called leading?
Well, I always feel responsibility to be honest. You know, no one forgets anything anymore. Even without blockchains,
well, yeah,
we had
there are
the Internet
tweets
Archive.
also, right?
Well, and tweets and stuff. So you always want to be credible. You always want to tell the truth. I mean, you know, nobody's an angel, right? But like, you want to be able to look back 5 or 10 years and at what you said 5 or 10 years ago and go, okay, even if that was wrong, at least there was a good kind of interpretation for that, right? Or a good reason for that statement, right? And then secondly, I've never been driven primarily by personal financial gain. I've always been driven by, you know, I mean, I grew up with the internet. I grew up with this kind of vision that this can be an uplifting force. And I worry less about, like, can we accomplish some weird technical thing, and more about the fact that the middle class is disappearing, that wealth inequality is like really rendering society apart. Like, there's so many bigger issues out there.
So these are the issues that you're trying to address by doing what you do?
I think with blockchain technology, like the auditability thing, if we can implement this in such a way that we can make markets fairer, you know, that we can avoid things like the mortgage crisis in 2008. The mortgage crisis in 2008 was a fantastic thing for a small number of investors, right? Because a lot of people walked out of that
with
making
a
pile of money,
yeah.
And it decimated the middle class in the United States. And if blockchain technology could have played a role in mitigating that or keeping that from happening, that would be great. And if we can do that for the next disaster like that, or if we can do that to reestablish people's confidence in government systems, that sort of thing, that would be great, and a great outcome.
So you think that if we had blockchain back then, it could have prevented the financial crisis we had?
It's not just me. A bunch of people have said if the mortgage-backed securities marketplace had been implemented using distributed ledgers to track who had held what title on which properties and which mortgages on those properties, had been used to give better visibility into the credit worthiness of those instruments, right? And the credit quality of those, rather than just taking Moody's AAA rating on those as
those
like
are crazy ratings, like insanely
but
crazy.
Investors, you know, sober investors made a lot of bets on those because they were willing to believe almost, I mean, the irrational exuberance kind of thing, right? Arguably, they could have done more diligence, but they were very opaque. There was not a lot of way to see through them. But that's not even the biggest win. The biggest win, if we had moved all of those, and if we had moved CDOs, the collateralized debt obligations, to be smart contracts, right? Then when the market started to run out of steam, when that exuberance started turning to pessimism, and people wanted out, they wanted to exit those instruments. You probably saw the movie The Big Short. You know, there's this panic that happened, and it was the panic that caused the damage, right? And if these had been automated smart contracts that simply ran, simply executed, you know, and simply started exiting people from positions and had access to all the right data, had a clear sense of who owned what, and you would have had many fewer incidents of people, I think, and Blythe Masters thinks this, other people out there think this, many fewer incidents of people selling assets for pennies on the dollar because they had no idea what was toxic underneath. You would have had less paperwork being manufactured out of thin air, right? You would have had fewer homeowners getting eviction notices from people who owned a fraction of a percent on their home. And so all this stuff would have been just, it might still have been damaging, you might still have seen a 20 or 30% pullback, but that would have been a fair market. It's an unfair market when, you know, paperwork disasters or when back office systems end up punishing the most disempowered people in that whole market, which in this case were the homeowners, and in some cases, some of the investors in these CDO instruments.
Well, I'm sure we won't get to that point once again, because a lot of people saying that we are heading to another financial crisis. So I hope blockchain will help, you know, prevent that. Yeah, and my last question, do you use any crypto buzzwords in your everyday life?
Any crypto passwords? What's the difference between a crypto password and an ordinary
Not related to crypto.
No, I don't think so.
You don't use HODL? No?
I'm not buying and selling tokens. I'm not buying and selling cryptocurrencies. Okay. So I'm logging into a lot of websites.
Okay. Okay, then we can teach you. Go to Cointelegraph. There are a lot of crypto buzzwords. Right. You'll love. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Cointelegraph. Like, subscribe, and HODL.